There's a moment in season 7, episode 1, that most people watch for one reason: the bat coming down. But that's not the moment I keep thinking about. It's the moment just before. Negan is pacing in front of the lineup, making eye contact with each survivor one at a time, performing. Every step deliberate, every pause theatrical, the whole thing designed to be felt, to be remembered, to land. And then he says it, calm as anything. You work for me now. It's a declaration that needs an audience. It needs the fear in the faces kneeling in the dirt to mean anything at all. Now go back to season 2. Shane Walsh in the quiet dark before a supply run, checking the watch rotation, making sure someone is on the wall, making sure the gaps are covered. No audience, no speech. Just the unglamorous, necessary work of keeping people alive. Here's the question I want to sit with tonight. What if one of those men was actually the better leader? And what if it's not the one holding the bat? Let's start with what feels like a simple comparison, but turns out, the longer you sit with it, to be anything but Shane Walsh and Negan. Two men who believed they were doing what needed to be done. Two men who made decisions that cost other people their lives and slept, or tried to sleep, with that weight. Two men the story framed, at different points, as the threat Rick Grimes had to overcome. But here's what strikes me when I look at them side by side. The show never actually answers the question of which model worked better. It shows us the cost of both. It shows us the failures of both, and then it moves on, leaving the comparison suspended in the air like something we're supposed to feel rather than resolve. Shane was Rick's partner before the outbreak. A King County sheriff's deputy, practical and capable, a man who ran toward that hospital when the world was collapsing and tried to get his friend out. He failed to extract Rick and genuinely believed he'd left a dead man behind. That matters for understanding everything that followed, because Shane's entire leadership identity during the early seasons was built on a specific kind of grief. The grief of a man who survived something he didn't expect to survive, who found purpose in keeping others alive, and who carried the guilt of what that survival had required. He didn't appoint himself leader of the Atlanta survivor camp. He just started doing the work, and people followed because the work was getting done. Negan's origin story is confirmed in the season 10 episode. Here's Negan, the standalone that showed us who he was before Lucille and the Saviors. A high school gym teacher. Difficult, yes. Competitive, sharp-edged, prone to anger, but also genuinely in love with his wife Lucille, in a way that clearly shaped everything he became after she died. The Saviors and their systems emerged from the specific catastrophe of losing her, of surviving the early outbreak without anyone to anchor the cost to. Negan didn't build a tribute economy because he was born cruel. He built it because, at some point in that early chaos, he looked around at what pure strength without structure looked like, and decided to build something more durable, something that would last. Two men, two origin stories built on loss, two leadership philosophies that worked for a time and then stopped working in specific ways that tell us something interesting. That's where I want to begin. The watch rotation is the motif I keep returning to, and we'll come back to it throughout this whole exploration. It's such a small thing. Someone has to stand at the wall. Someone has to check the perimeter in the early hours when everyone else is asleep. Shane did it. He organised it without being asked. No title, no ceremony, no reward. Just the understanding that if nobody covered that shift, people died. It's the kind of leadership that doesn't photograph well, but it kept the Atlanta camp alive longer than it had any right to be. Here's what Shane Walsh's leadership actually looked like in practice, because I think the emotional memory of his final episodes, the jealousy, the confrontations, the deterioration, tends to overshadow how capable he genuinely was in the seasons before all of that. Back in season 1, when the survivor camp outside Atlanta was still intact, Shane was the one running things. He organised the daily structure, the watch shifts, the supply runs, the defensive perimeter around the camp. He assessed threats and made calls. When the CDC trip became the group's best option in Season 1, Episode 5, Wildfire, Shane pushed back, argued the road was safer than trusting an unknown institution. He was wrong about that specific call, but the instinct underneath it was consistent. Don't put the group in a position where their survival depends on someone else's infrastructure. Don't trust walls you didn't build yourself. Keep the options open. That instinct, for the record, was proven correct repeatedly in later seasons. The prison's walls, Woodbury's deceptions, the terminus gates with their cheerful signs about a sanctuary. Shane's skepticism about fixed locations and institutional trust was validated over and over by a show that kept killing people who trusted the wrong structures. What I find interesting about Shane's model is how deliberately untheatrical it was. There's a scene in Season 2 during the farm period where Shane is just moving through the group's camp, checking supplies, talking to people quietly, assessing what they have and what they need. He's not making speeches. He's not creating mythology around himself. He's doing the kind of administrative triage that most people find too mundane to notice until it stops happening. The farm gave Shane a particular kind of frustration, and I think that frustration reveals something important about his leadership psychology. He could see the farm's vulnerabilities clearly. The fence, the open terrain, the walkers accumulating at the edges, the group's growing comfort with the illusion of normalcy. He said it out loud more than once. "This place is a tomb," he tells Rick at one point, and the disagreement between them isn't really about the farm. It's about whether hope is a resource or a liability. For Shane, hope without a tactical plan was dangerous. It made people slow. It made them choose comfort over security. He watched the group settle into Herschel's farm and saw a group making itself vulnerable. He watched Laurie's pregnancy become a reason to stay rather than a logistics problem to plan around. He watched Rick's moral framework keep generating debates when Shane believed the situation required decisions. He wasn't wrong about the farm. Season 2's finale, beside the dying fire, proved that. The herd came through. The farm fell. The group scattered into the dark and lost people and each other. Shane had been dead for several episodes by then, but his analysis was still standing. What Shane's model required, though, was his presence. That's the structural limitation that the theory has to be honest about. His leadership didn't create systems that could function without him. He didn't build a council, delegate authority, or create redundant lines of responsibility. He was the watch rotation. He was the supply run logic. Remove Shane from the equation, and the model had no second in command, no institutional memory, no continuity. There's something genuinely human about that limitation, and I don't think it's entirely accidental. Shane was someone who kept people alive the way you keep people alive when you love them specifically, by being there, by doing the work personally, by refusing to outsource the cost. That's a beautiful impulse. It's also a fragile infrastructure. The gesture of Shane organising that watch rotation without being asked. The silence of a camp that didn't always understand why the rules existed. The object of the watch schedule itself. A piece of paper nobody else would think to maintain. 3 anchors for a leadership model that worked right up until the moment it needed to be bigger than one man. And that's where the comparison starts to get interesting, because Negan's model was built for exactly that problem, the problem of scale, and it solved it in a way that raises its own set of uncomfortable questions. Negan understood something Shane never had to grapple with. What happens when your group gets too big to lead by personal presence alone? The saviours, by the time we meet them in Season 6, are a regional operation. Multiple outposts. Hundreds of people. The exact number is never given in canon, so I'll treat it as approximate. but visually we're talking about a community that dwarfs anything Rick's group had managed. The sanctuary itself is a functioning settlement with work assignments, sleeping areas, a point system for access to goods, and a hierarchical structure that extends well beyond Negan himself. There are lieutenants, Simon, Dwight, Gavin, each managing a different part of the operation. There are rules, and the rules apply consistently, and everybody knows what the rules are. That's not nothing. In fact, in the Walking Dead universe, that's remarkable. The tribute system, half of everything collected by the communities under Negan's control, is brutal in its economic logic. Hilltop, the Kingdom, and Oceanside all survived under it. They didn't thrive exactly, but they kept their people fed, kept their walls intact, kept their populations alive. The Saviours provided muscle, cleared roads, managed walker threats, created a kind of brutal regional order that before Rick's coalition dismantled it, was functionally working at the level of basic survival. The line Negan delivers in Season 7, the one that became almost a chant, "We are all Negan," is worth sitting with as a piece of institutional design rather than just a power display. What Negan built was a collective identity, not loyalty to him personally exactly, but loyalty to the idea of the Saviours as a framework, a way of surviving that people had internalised as their own. When Dwight, in his early Saviours appearances, tells Rick's group, "I am Negan," he's not just reciting a line, he's performing a kind of membership that the system required. And that performed membership, however coerced, created a structure that could survive any individual person's absence, except one. That's the flaw in the architecture, and it's the flaw the show exploits. The backstory episode, "Here's Negan," shows us the man before the mythology. He's rough, complicated, genuinely devoted to his wife Lucille in a way that reads as his most authentic emotional fact. When she dies, in that episode, in the early outbreak chaos and Krunky monarchy, something in Negan's emotional circuitry reconfigures around the absence. He names the bat after her. He builds a world that he can control in ways he couldn't control her illness, her death, the randomness that took her. The Saviours aren't just a survival strategy. They're a grief response that got large enough to become a civilization. I find that origin genuinely moving, and I think it's important for the comparison, because Negan and Shane are, at their emotional foundations, running the same software. Both men built their leadership identities around loss. Both men decided that the world couldn't be trusted and that control, personal, direct, unflinching control, was the only honest response to that untrustworthiness. The difference is scale and method, not origin. Negan's method, the psychological dominance, the performances with Lucille, the theatrical rule setting, was designed to work on large groups of people who didn't know him personally. Shane's method, direct, practical, relationship-based, was designed for groups small enough that everyone knew him personally. Neither method translates cleanly to the other's operating environment. And yet, the name Sanctuary. I keep coming back to that choice. Negan, who built a system on fear, named his home a place of refuge. That's either cynical branding, and it might be, or it's a residue of the man from Here's Negan, the one who wanted to protect something, who believed he was still, at some level, building a sanctuary for the people inside his walls. Negan telling Rick's group in Season 7 that he's keeping civilization alive isn't entirely a performance. He seems to believe it, at least partially. And that partial belief is what makes him, like Shane, genuinely complicated. The watch rotation is still running in my head as I think about Negan's outpost structure. He scaled it. He built a system where the watch happened even when he wasn't there to organise it. But he also replaced the human motivation for doing the watch. care, community, found family, with institutional obligation and the threat of consequences. Is a watch that's kept because of fear less effective than a watch that's kept out of care? Functionally, maybe not. Emotionally, that's where the theory gets interesting. Let me take you back to Season 2, Episode 3. Save the last one, because it might be the single scene that best illustrates the difference between Shane's leadership model and Negan's, even though Negan isn't anywhere near it. Shane and Otis went to the high school together to retrieve medical equipment for Carl. The run was always going to be difficult. The school was overrun, the equipment was in a specific location, and escape required moving through a building full of walkers with limited ammunition. They got in, they got the supplies, and they couldn't get out. Running. Cornered. Out of options. Shane shot Otis in the leg, left him for the walkers, took the bag with the supplies that would save Carl's life, and got out. Carl lived. Now compare that to Season 7, Episode 1. The day will come when you won't be, when Negan lines up Rick's group, selects Glenn and Abraham, and kills them both. Not to solve a tactical problem, not to save a specific life that was actively dying, to demonstrate consequence, to establish, through the most visceral possible method, that the rules are real and the enforcer is serious. Glenn and Abraham died as a message. Otis died as a calculation. I'm not asking you to feel better about one than the other. Both are genuinely terrible, and the show presents both as terrible. But the structural difference matters for the leadership comparison. Shane's violence in that scene was instrumentally targeted. One specific death, in service of one specific outcome, with a clear causal logic linking the action to the result. Negan's violence was designed to produce a general effect: fear, compliance, institutional memory, through a demonstration that exceeded the minimum necessary force. Both men believed they were protecting their people. But Shane's calculus was immediate and specific. Otis or Carl. Negan's calculus was systemic and anticipatory. 2 deaths now, to prevent the resistance that might cost more deaths later. One of these models is terrible to live under. One of these models is terrible to be adjacent to in a crisis. The show keeps showing us that both truths are simultaneously valid. And that's exactly what makes the comparison so hard to resolve cleanly. There's a detail in Shane's aftermath worth noting. After returning to the farm with the supplies, Shane sits through Otis's memorial, conducted by Otis's partner Patricia, in grief and holds the lie about what happened in his body. He tells the group Otis died heroically covering their escape. He shaves his head afterward. The head shave is the show's visual language for transformation. Something psychologically shed, something harder taking its place. Shane knows what he did. He carries it. He doesn't perform remorse for an audience. He sits alone in the bathroom with a razor and the weight of his own choice. Negan, by contrast, performs the aftermath of his violence for the audience still present. The walk down the lineup after the deaths in Season 7 is theatre. Designed to be witnessed, designed to land, designed to create the specific, emotional residue that compliance requires. He's not carrying the weight alone, he's distributing it, making everyone present carry a piece of it, which is its own kind of manipulation. 3 anchors in that comparison: Shane's razor in the dark, the silence of Otis's memorial, Lucille resting on Negan's shoulder like an extension of his arm. The franchise returns to this pattern. The question of whether necessary violence is different from demonstrative violence. In almost every major antagonist arc that follows. The Governor's raids, Gareth's terminus logic, Alpha's border markers. Each time the show is asking, what's the minimum necessary cost of keeping people alive, and who gets to decide when that minimum has been reached? Shane's answer was intimate and specific. Negan's answer was institutional and general. The argument between those two answers has been running through the franchise for over a decade, and I don't think it's been resolved yet. What I find most interesting is this. Both men would have recognised the other's logic. Shane would have understood on some level what Negan was trying to build. Negan, I think, would have respected Shane's efficiency. They would have disagreed profoundly about method, but they would have understood each other. That might be the most unsettling thing about this comparison. Here's where the arithmetic gets genuinely difficult, and I want to sit with the difficulty rather than resolve it too quickly. By the measure of raw survival outcomes, Negan's record is hard to argue with. Under his system, the sanctuary was operational and populated. Hilltop survived. The Kingdom survived. Oceanside survived. Multiple communities, across a significant geographic footprint, were alive and functioning, however unhappily, for the duration of Negan's authority. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly what a post-apocalyptic regional government is supposed to do in its most basic terms: keep populations alive. Shane's survival record is more complicated to assess because his operating window was shorter and his scale was smaller. The Atlanta camp, which he effectively ran, was partially intact before the group moved to Herschel's farm. The camp's losses, including the attack in Season 1, Episode 4, Vartos, where walkers breached the camp at night, happened on his watch. He made the call to delay evacuation in ways that cost people. The farm, which he spent months warning was unsustainable, fell after his death. His protective instincts were sound. His ability to make those instincts stick was limited by the group's willingness to follow him without Rick's formal authority backing his decisions. That gap matters. Shane could see what needed to happen. He could not always make it happen because the group's decision-making structure kept deferring to Rick, whose moral framework generated delays that Shane experienced as dangerous. When Rick and Herschel debated the fate of Randall, the prisoner held in the barn in Season 2, Shane resolved the debate by taking action unilaterally. He saw the debate itself as the threat. He didn't have the institutional authority to override the group's process, so he went around it. Negan never had that problem. His system didn't produce debates. It produced compliance, which is efficient but different from agreement. And the difference between compliance and agreement is exactly what the All-Out War arc exposed. When Rick's coalition began operating in Seasons 7 and 8, the compliance that had looked like stability started revealing its fracture lines. Simon's unauthorized massacres, Dwight's quiet turn. The lieutenants who were loyal to the system but not to the man, or to the man but not the system, depending on which pressure was applied. The whole infrastructure was held together by Negan's personal mythology, and once that mythology was credibly challenged, the loyalty it had generated was revealed as thinner than it appeared. Shane's loyalty base, by contrast, was genuinely relational. The people who followed Shane, and several did, including T-Dog and Andrea, in different ways at different points, followed him because they trusted him personally. That trust was harder to manufacture and harder to maintain at scale. But it was also harder to break. The pattern the franchise keeps returning to is this: systems built on fear survive acute threats better than systems built on love, and systems built on love survive institutional pressure better than systems built on fear. Neither is adequate alone. The show keeps showing us communities that have one and not the other, and keeps showing us those communities failing for exactly the reason you'd predict. Negan's sanctuary was extraordinarily good at surviving acute threats. Walker hordes, rival communities, resource scarcity. It was fragile under sustained internal pressure, specifically the pressure of people who had complied long enough to find their own courage. Shane's model was good at building genuine loyalty, but couldn't survive the scaling problem. 10 people following Shane because they trusted him was a functional group. 50 people following Shane would have required Shane to delegate trust to sub-leaders he hadn't built relationships with yet. And there's no evidence in canon that Shane had the patience or the institutional imagination for that kind of delegation. Here's where I find myself genuinely uncertain, and I want to name that uncertainty. I don't know whether Shane could have grown into a different kind of leader given more time. The show didn't give him that time. What we have is a season 2 portrait of a man under extraordinary personal and professional pressure, making tactical decisions that the story both validates and condemns. Whether the man in Save the Last One could have eventually become the man who built Herschel's legacy forward, thoughtful, institutional, durable, is a question the show deliberately left unanswered. That question is part of what makes this comparison feel alive rather than academic. The thing about fear as a leadership tool is that it works. Until it doesn't. And when it stops working, it stops completely. Negan's system was built on fear in a very specific, deliberate way. Not the ambient fear that all Walking Dead communities live with. The fear of walkers, of scarcity, of loss, but a managed, directed, institutional fear designed to produce behavioural compliance. The saviours enforced rules through consequences that were public, severe and memorable. The iron, Dwight's burn scar, confirmed in Season 7, is one of the clearest symbols of how this worked. A rule was broken. The consequence was applied in front of witnesses. The memory of that consequence shaped behaviour afterward, in Dwight and in everyone who heard the story. This is, in a cold institutional sense, a rational system. It's also what Negan's breakdown during the all-out war reveals as structurally fragile. A system built on fear requires the constant credibility of its threat. The moment Rick's coalition demonstrated that resistance was survivable, that the fear could be defied, and the cost paid, and survival on the other side was possible, the architecture started cracking. People like Dwight, who had been performing loyalty under coercion, found their window, and the system that had looked durable began falling apart from within. Shane used fear differently, selectively in specific situations, without building it into the management structure. His confrontations, with Rick, with Otis, with the group when he felt they were being dangerously naive, were personal and situational. He didn't need people to be afraid of him generally. He needed specific people to take specific threats seriously in specific moments. That's a very different emotional relationship to fear as a tool. And it meant that when Shane's personal credibility was challenged, when Rick returned and the group began gravitating back to Rick's framework, Shane didn't have an institutional structure to fall back on. He had his own presence and his own relationships, and when those weren't enough, he had nothing. There's an observation in the Daryl Dixon arc that I think is relevant here, even though Daryl isn't in the leadership comparison directly. Daryl, across the whole run of the show and into his own spin-off, consistently resists the kind of authority that both Shane and Negan represent. He doesn't organise watch rotations without being asked, and he doesn't build tribute systems. He operates on something closer to pure relationship loyalty, protecting the people immediately in front of him without framework or institution. It's the most emotionally honest leadership model in the franchise, and also the least scalable. Daryl's version of leadership works beautifully for groups of 2, 5, maybe 10. It has no institutional form at all. I mention this because Daryl represents the spectrum's far end in a way that clarifies both Shane and Negan by contrast. Shane was trying to move from Daryl scale loyalty towards something more structured, without quite knowing how. Negan had moved far past structure into something that no longer resembled the original impulse. Both of them, in different ways, had lost the thread that connects leadership to the people being led. The franchise's recurring argument, and I think this is one of the most consistent thematic patterns across all the shows, from the main series through Fear and World Beyond, is that no purely utilitarian leader survives long-term without the human variable. Every system that optimizes for survival at the expense of the thing survival is supposed to protect eventually collapses under its own logic. The CRM is the most developed version of this argument, but it was already present in Negan's sanctuary and foreshadowed in Shane's escalation. What both Shane and Negan kept losing, in their different ways, was the reason the watch matters. The watch rotation exists because people care about the people sleeping inside the walls. When it becomes a system of obligation, rather than an expression of care, it still gets done. But something essential has leaked out of it, and the leak has consequences you don't always see until they are catastrophic. That's the pattern the franchise keeps documenting, season after season. The cost of separating the function from the feeling. Here's something I think gets underappreciated in discussions of both Shane and Negan. How much they each actually understood about people, in ways that were real and not always wrong. Shane's psychological intelligence was small-scale and specific. He understood individual people. He read Carl correctly, understood that the boy needed structure, activity, purpose, and not just the comfort of his mother's presence. His relationship with Carl in seasons 1 and 2, before the deterioration, was genuinely paternal in the best sense. He taught Carl things, took him seriously, treated him as someone developing rather than just someone to protect. That's a form of emotional intelligence that the show gives Shane clearly and consistently. He also read the group dynamics accurately at the farm in ways that mattered. He saw that the comfort of the location was making people slow. He saw that the debates about Randall were a kind of moral self-indulgence the group couldn't afford. He saw the relationship between Laurie and Rick generating a leadership paralysis that had real tactical consequences. None of those readings were wrong. The problem was that his response to correct readings was almost always to act, rather than to persuade. And acting without bringing the group along meant the group kept drifting back to the framework he was trying to move them away from. Negan's psychological intelligence operated at a completely different register. He understood crowd psychology, collective identity, and the way people need narrative to function. The name Sanctuary isn't just cynical branding. It's evidence that Negan understood what people needed to believe about where they lived. People need a story about their own lives that makes those lives feel meaningful, survivable, worth continuing. Negan gave the saviors that story. We are the ones keeping civilization alive. We are the strong ones. We are the reason the weak survive. Terrible story, but structurally it did what stories need to do. It created shared identity and forward direction. The season 7 episode that shows Negan in the sanctuary, walking the floor, talking to workers, maintaining the myth of his approachability, reveals a man who understood that even fear-based systems need the occasional human touch to stay functional. He knows names. He makes jokes. He performs warmth selectively in ways that keep people slightly off balance between fear and something that almost resembles connection. It's manipulation, clearly, but it's also intelligent. He's maintaining a system that covers hundreds of people across multiple locations, and he's doing it largely through the management of perception. Shane could never have done that, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his emotional range didn't include the performed warmth that Negan deployed strategically. Shane's interactions were almost always direct and often confrontational. He didn't have a gear for managed approachability. His people knew where they stood with him, which is honest, but it's not always what people need from a leader of thousands. The motif of the watch rotation continues to evolve here. In Shane's version, he organises it, he takes shifts himself. His personal presence signals to the group that the danger is real and being managed. In Negan's version, there's a structured security rotation at every outpost, enforced by lieutenants, running on obligation and consequence. Both watches are being kept. Both perimeters are covered. But the quality of attention, the reason someone is standing there in the dark, is completely different. Some fans in the community have raised the question of whether Negan's system, for all its cruelty, actually represented a more honest reckoning with what the post-apocalyptic world required at scale. Others argue that it was simply abuse with an institutional wrapper, that the survival outcomes don't justify the human cost, and that Rick was right to dismantle it regardless of the temporary chaos that followed. Both of those arguments feel true to me, in different proportions depending on which episode I'm watching, and I think the show intends that tension rather than resolving it. What both men understood, in their different registers, was that leadership is fundamentally about managing other people's fear. Shane managed it through presence and directness. Negan managed it through theatre and consequence. Neither method is clean. Both methods worked until they didn't. And that's where the pattern starts to click. Or at least it might. Every leadership model has a failure mode, and the most instructive thing about studying Shane and Negan side by side is how precisely each man failed in the exact way his model predicted he would. Shane's collapse was personal and emotional. The Laurie situation, the history between them, the pregnancy, the guilt, the grief, wasn't separate from his leadership failures. It was the specific pressure point his model couldn't absorb. Shane's approach required emotional compartmentalization that he turned out to be incapable of. He could separate the Otis calculation from his feelings about Otis because Otis was a stranger, and the outcome was Carl's life. He could not separate his feelings about Rick and Laurie from his operational judgment, because those feelings were load-bearing elements of his entire psychology. When they became impossible to contain, everything else went with them. The confrontations in Season 2, the escalating arguments with Rick, the increasingly erratic behaviour at the farm, read as a man whose leadership model depended on emotional control, he was progressively losing. He started making decisions from the wounded, reactive part of himself rather than the clear-eyed, tactical part. The attack on Rick in Season 2, Episode 12, walking Rick into that field with a plan that required Rick not to see it coming, was a failure of Shane's own intelligence. He knew Rick. He should have known Rick would see it. The plan was emotional, not tactical. That's what the failure mode looks like when it arrives. The strength of the model, personal intelligence, relational accuracy, direct action, turns against itself when the personal becomes overwhelming. Negan's failure mode was systemic and anticipatory, and it arrived through Rick's coalition across the Season 7 and Season 8 arc of the all-out war. The supply line disruptions worked because Negan's system had no redundancy. It depended on the continued flow of tribute from the communities that stayed compliant, and once compliance was credibly challenged, the flow stopped. The sanctuary under siege, the workers hungry, the structural violence of the system suddenly visible as a vulnerability rather than a strength. All of it followed logically from the architecture's single point of failure. Negan's personal myth had to remain credible or nothing held together. What's interesting about comparing these two failure modes is that they mirror each other in a structural way. Shane's model failed because it was too personal. It couldn't survive the leader's emotional breakdown. Negan's model failed because it tried to eliminate the personal entirely, and in doing so, eliminated the genuine loyalty that might have provided resilience when the institutional logic was challenged. Rick's arc, sitting between both men, traces a similar path in slow motion. He inherits Shane's personal intensity and Negan's tactical ruthlessness across different seasons, and the show keeps documenting how both create costs. The prison arc. Thomas's execution, the clearing of King County in Season 3, Episode 12, shows Rick operating in Shane's register, direct and decisive. The later all-out war arc shows Rick making Negan-scale strategic calculations, thinking in populations rather than individuals. Neither register feels quite right on Rick. He's always slightly mismatched with the philosophy he's currently running, which might be the show's most honest observation about leadership, that it fits nobody perfectly, and the cost of trying to make it fit is always paid by the people being led. The franchise's recurring argument resurfaces here with something like clarity. The best leadership isn't the most effective leadership. It's the leadership most willing to carry the cost visibly, without performance and without denial. Both Shane and Negan denied costs in different ways, Shane through compartmentalization, Negan through theatre. The denial was the failure, not the difficulty of the choices themselves. Herschel understood this differently. He carried his cost openly, in front of everyone, across multiple seasons. The loss of his farm, his son, his leg, his faith. He didn't resolve those losses into a philosophy of control. He carried them and kept choosing care anyway. That's why his legacy travels forward through Maggie and Glenn's son, and the community values that survive even the communities themselves. The watch rotation, kept by someone who's afraid but shows up anyway, out of love rather than obligation. That's the version both Shane and Negan were reaching for, from different directions without quite arriving. Here's the core of what I actually think, offered carefully and clearly as theory, rather than certainty. Shane Walsh would have been a better leader than Negan, but only at a specific scale, under specific conditions, and in ways that come with costs neither man fully acknowledged. Let me build that out. Shane's model, relational, direct, personal, immediate, was functionally optimal for a group of roughly 15 to 30 people, navigating acute survival threats in a relatively compressed geographic area. The Atlanta camp, the farm, potentially the prison in its early days. Those are environments where Shane's approach would have worked consistently well. His ability to read individual people, his tactical clarity, his willingness to make decisions without the deliberation that cost the group time they didn't have, all of those strengths would have expressed themselves clearly in those conditions. The evidence from Season 2 supports this. Shane's calls were right more often than they were wrong. His frustrations with Rick's process were legitimate tactical concerns. The farm's fall vindicated his structural analysis. And unlike the governor, who had comparable efficiency instincts and used them in service of ego and cruelty, Shane's efficiency was pointed at the group's survival rather than his own dominance. That matters. Efficiency in service of care is different from efficiency in service of control, even when the behaviours look similar from the outside. Negan, at small scale, would likely have been worse. The theatrical dominance, the psychological manipulation, the tribute economy, all of that machinery was built for large groups and becomes disproportionate and abusive at intimate scale. Imagine Negan running the Atlanta camp. The performances would have alienated people. The coercive loyalty would have fractured the small community's genuine bonds. The Lucille demonstrations would have been catastrophic for a group of 15 people trying to function as a found family. Negan was built for the scale he found himself at. Shane was built for the scale he started at. But here's where the theory gets genuinely complicated. The survival world the show depicts keeps growing. More people, more communities, more complex resource and security problems that demand more than any single-scale model can provide. And at regional scale, Shane's model doesn't have an answer. Shane showed no evidence of the institutional imagination that building something like the sanctuary would require. He showed no interest in delegation, in myth-making, in building systems that could run without his physical presence. He was a man of immediate personal action, and that person doesn't naturally become an institution builder without a significant transformation. The speculation I keep returning to, and I want to be transparent that this is theory, not confirmation, is that a Shane who survived season 2 and was forced to scale up might have eventually built something with Negan's structural logic, simply because the structural logic is what large-scale survival requires. Not out of cruelty, not out of the specific pain that shaped Negan's methods, but out of the same basic recognition that Shane already had. The world doesn't care about your feelings, and people die when you let feelings override the math. Some fans in the community go further and argue that Shane and Negan were always going to converge, that the Walking Dead universe's operating conditions generate a specific kind of leader, regardless of starting character, and that the differences between Shane and Negan are mostly aesthetic. I find that reading too deterministic. I think character matters. I think Negan's specific cruelties, the iron, the systematic humiliation, the way the tribute system was designed to keep communities permanently diminished, reflect specific choices that weren't structurally required, even at regional scale. Shane might have built something larger without building exactly that, but I also can't confidently claim Shane would have built something better. The honest answer is, we don't know. The show made its choice. What we can observe is that every structural feature of the problem Shane was failing to solve in season 2, scale, institutional continuity, the management of strangers rather than friends, is exactly what Negan's system was designed to address. Whether a Shane-shaped person could have addressed those problems more humanely is the question the show deliberately left open by removing him from the story. The watch rotation in this reading is the thing both men were trying to protect and neither quite managed to preserve. The moment when someone stands in the dark because they genuinely care whether the people sleeping inside the walls wake up in the morning. Let me sit with the hypothetical a little longer, because the cost side of Shane's potential leadership is as important as the benefit side, and I think the show actually gives us a model for what it might have looked like. If Shane had lived into season 3 and taken the prison as his operational base, my guess, offered as theory, not confirmation, is that it would have looked something like a leaner, harsher version of what Rick built, with some of the governor's efficiency and less of his theatrical cruelty. Shane would have cleared the prison faster. He would have made decisions about who got resources and who didn't, with less agonising than Rick's process generated. He would have read the governor's approach earlier and responded more aggressively, possibly preventing some of the siege's damage. The cost would have been felt in the texture of daily life inside those walls. Shane had a limited tolerance for vulnerability, for people who couldn't contribute to the group's tactical needs. His model of worth was operational. Can you run a watch shift? Can you manage a supply run? Can you hold a weapon and use it effectively? People who couldn't meet those standards, elderly, very young children, traumatised survivors, would have been kept alive because Shane wasn't cruel in the simple sense, but their presence would have been experienced as a problem to manage rather than a reason the walls existed. The Governor's Woodbury, confirmed across season 3, is the closest canon parallel to what Shane's prison might have looked like. Woodbury functioned. It had walls, power, food, medical supplies. It had entertainment, the arena, terrible as it was, which suggests the governor understood that people needed more than bare survival to keep functioning. But it was built on concealed atrocities, on the management of what people were allowed to know about how their survival was being maintained. The governor's cruelty was performative and ego-serving in ways Shane's wasn't. But the structural resemblance, a fortified community run by someone with high tactical intelligence and limited patience for moral deliberation, is worth acknowledging. What Carl would have become in Shane's prison is the emotional question the theory keeps generating. Carl, under Rick, grew into someone with deep moral seriousness, someone who grappled with what survival required and refused to let it fully erase his humanity. That development was shaped by Rick's insistence on maintaining certain values, even when they were inconvenient. Under Shane, Carl's development would likely have been faster, harder, more efficient, and less reflective. Carl already showed tactical instincts that Shane would have recognised and cultivated. But the version of Carl who spent his formative years in Shane's leadership environment might have been a better fighter and a less complete person. That trade-off, tactical efficiency for human depth, is exactly what the franchise keeps insisting on as a choice that matters. Not just philosophically, but practically, because the communities that survive long-term in the Walking Dead universe aren't just the ones with the best walls, they're the ones with the most reason to keep the walls standing. And reason to keep the walls standing is generated by the human depth. Shane's model tended to subordinate. There's a fan community argument, and I want to include it here because it's genuinely compelling, that Shane alive through Season 3 would have prevented some of the prison's worst moments, that his tactical aggression would have closed off the governor's opportunities for the kind of extended siege that ultimately destroyed the community, and that the bodies lost in the prison fall, Herschel, the other survivors, the sense of safety that the group never quite rebuilt afterward, might have been spared. That's a real counterpoint. The moral cost of Shane's methods might have been lower than the human cost of Rick's process orientation in that specific scenario. I don't think either reading is wrong. Both are canon grounded in the sense that the evidence supports both interpretations. What I find most honest is holding them simultaneously. Shane's model would have saved specific people and cost the community something harder to count. Both things are true. The gesture, Shane's hand checking the prison fence for weaknesses before anyone else thought to look. The silence of the governor watching from the tree line while Rick debated. The symbol, Herschel's watch, passed forward, ticking in someone's pocket while the prison burned. Here's the counterpoint to everything I've been building, and I think it's important enough to sit with at length. Negan, after the Saviours. Negan in Alexandria during the Whisperer War. Negan in Season 10, growing vegetables and living quietly, under house arrest and being, by most observable measures, genuinely trying to be a different kind of person. And then Dead City, the 2023 spin-off, where Negan goes with Maggie into Manhattan to retrieve her son, Herschel Jr., from a community operating under the kind of brutal logic the old Negan would have recognised and possibly admired. What Dead City does over the course of its first season is demonstrate something the earlier show kept gesturing at without fully showing. That Negan's capacity for genuine loyalty was always there. It was suppressed under the Saviour's model. Deliberately, structurally, because that model required him to treat loyalty as a liability and connection as a weakness. But the loyalty itself, the capacity for genuine care about specific people, wasn't gone. It was waiting. Negan protecting Herschel Jr. in Dead City isn't a performance. The show doesn't frame it as a strategic calculation. It frames it as a man doing something that costs him personally, for a reason that isn't institutional, and isn't about power, and isn't about managing fear. He does it because the kid matters to him, in the specific, irrational, inefficient way that people matter when you've stopped organising your survival around the premise that other people are resources. That matters enormously for the comparison, because it suggests that the Negan of the Saviour's era wasn't the full picture of who Negan was. The Saviour's model shaped his behaviour, and his behaviour shaped the system, and the system amplified certain aspects of his character while suppressing others. The leader we met in Season 6 was real, but not complete. And here's where the parallel to Shane becomes genuinely moving, I think. Shane in Season 2 was also not the full picture. He was a man under extraordinary personal pressure, running a leadership model that was being tested beyond its designed capacity, in an emotional environment that kept activating the worst version of his instincts. What Shane might have been, given different conditions, less personal chaos, more institutional support, more time, is the question the show's structure prevented him from answering. Both men in the versions we saw were partial. Both were suppressing something real in service of survival. Negan was suppressing his capacity for genuine connection. Shane was suppressing his capacity for patience and institutional thinking. What both needed, and what neither quite got, was enough stability to let the suppressed part come back online. Rick's found family, Alexandria, the prison community, the relationships that survived all the losses, represents the show's argument that stability of that kind is possible. Not safe stability, not unchallenged stability, but enough relational anchoring to let people be more than their survival instincts. Shane never had that anchoring, not after Rick came back. Negan didn't have it until Rick removed him from power, and the slow process of the Alexandria years began. The theory I want to leave here, clearly framed as interpretation, is that Shane and Negan represent two versions of the same underlying character, a man with real leadership capability and real human capacity for loyalty, whose specific trauma configured his survival instincts in ways that made him dangerous to the communities he was trying to protect. The difference between them is timing and scale. Shane never had the time. Negan had too much scale before the human part could reassert itself. If Shane had lived, and if the show had given him the space that it eventually gave Negan, my guess is that we would have seen something similar to what Dead City shows us. A man discovering that the thing he was protecting all along wasn't survival in the abstract. It was specific people. And specific people require being treated as people, which is the one thing neither Shane's model nor Negan's model was built to do consistently. The watch rotation keeps running through all of this. Someone is standing in the dark. The question is whether they're there because they're afraid of the consequences if they leave, or because there's someone inside those walls they can't bear to lose. Both men were trying to answer that question. Neither answer was complete. The franchise has a pattern that becomes unmistakable once you've seen it enough times. It doesn't place its answers in pure types. Every character who carries a single philosophy to its logical conclusion, every Shane, every Negan, every governor, eventually collapses under the weight of that purity. The answer, when it comes, always lives in the composite figures, the ones who hold contradictions without resolving them. Rick was the first composite. Shane's pragmatism and Dale's ethics carried in the same body, generating the moral friction that powered 12 seasons. He never resolved the contradiction cleanly because the show didn't want him to. It wanted the tension to remain visible, to keep producing the questions that are the series' real engine. Maggie is another. Glenn's humanity, the genuine, warm, almost irrational commitment to seeing people as worthy of care, combined with the hardness that loss builds in a person who refuses to stop caring. By the time of Dead City, Maggie is capable of extraordinary tactical coldness and extraordinary emotional fidelity, sometimes in the same episode. That combination is specifically Glenn-shaped in its emotional architecture and specifically post-Glenn in its willingness to use force without losing the reason force matters. Daryl's composite is different in texture, but follows the same logic. Shane's protectiveness, the genuine, ferocious commitment to keeping specific people alive, without Shane's need for control or recognition. Daryl's leadership across the spin-off is quietly, consistently about presence over performance. He shows up, he does the work, he doesn't build systems around himself. That's Shane's best quality, extracted from the emotional volatility that made Shane ultimately destructive, and carried forward in a body that seems to have made peace with the costs of care. And then there's Judith. She's the synthesis generation in the most complete sense, carrying both Rick's moral framework and the tactical clarity of the harder lessons the apocalypse has been teaching since before she was born. In the later seasons, confirmed across seasons 9 through 11, Judith demonstrates something neither Shane nor Negan quite managed: the ability to hold the survival math and the human stakes simultaneously without letting one erase the other. She knows the watch matters. She also knows why the watch matters. Both things are present in the same moment, without contradiction. The sheriff's hat on Judith's head is the motif's full transformation. That hat began, in this theory's logic, as something adjacent to Shane, worn by Rick as the external marker of the authority Shane had been exercising without formal recognition. Passed to Carl, it became the inheritance of both men's choices, on a child too young to have chosen either one. On Judith, it becomes something beyond both of them, not the symbol of a specific leadership philosophy, but the symbol of continuity itself, of the work getting done across generations by people who remember who taught them to do it. The watch rotation is still running. Someone is still on the wall. But in Judith's version, the person on the wall isn't there because they're afraid of what happens if they leave, and they're not there because their presence alone is holding the whole structure together. They're there because they understand that the wall protects something specific. People they know, memories that matter, a community that has chosen to keep existing together. And that understanding is institutional, in the best sense. It can be passed on. It can survive the person who first felt it. That's what Shane was reaching for when he set up the watch rotation without being asked. That's what Negan was trying to build when he named his settlement the Sanctuary. Neither of them quite got there, for different reasons in different ways. But the thing they were reaching for is real, and the franchise has been documenting its gradual construction across every season and spin-off. The leader the Walking Dead universe actually needed wasn't Shane or Negan. It was the community that could absorb both of their hard-won knowledge, the tactical clarity, the scale instinct, the willingness to make decisions under pressure, and attach it to something worth protecting. And communities are built slowly, out of small, unglamorous acts over time, like keeping the watch rotation running, season after season, in the dark before dawn. Go back to that moment in Season 7, Episode 1, Negan pacing the lineup. The bat raised, the declaration, "You work for me now," delivered to a group kneeling in the dirt. Now hold it next to the image from Season 2 that started all of this. Shane in the quiet before a supply run, checking the watch rotation. Methodical, practical. No audience for what he's doing and no need for one. The question I started with was, what if the man who could lead without the crowd was the better leader all along? Having spent this whole exploration in the evidence and the successes, the failures, the costs, the composites, I want to be honest about where I've landed, while staying open to where you might land. I don't think the question has a clean answer, and I think the franchise knows it doesn't. Better keep shifting depending on what you're measuring. Better at keeping people alive in immediate danger. Shane, at his best, in his optimal conditions. Better at building something that could function across a region and survive the leader's absence. Negan's model, for all its brutality, came closer to that than Shane's ever could. Better at creating a community worth surviving into. Neither of them. That achievement belongs to the people who came after. To Maggie, to Daryl, to Carol, to Judith, to the composite figures who took what both men understood and attached it to something human. The closing question the franchise keeps refusing to answer, and I think this refusal is the show's most honest act, is whether the best leader is the one who kept the most people alive or the one who left them worth saving. Shane and Negan both saved people, both left costs that the people they saved are still paying. The calculation doesn't close. What I find myself sitting with at the end of this is something quieter than a verdict. It's the image of that watch rotation running forward, through Shane's practical organisation of it, through Negan's institutional enforcement of it, through Rick's morally exhausted maintenance of it, through Daryl's wordless continuation of it, through Judith's understanding of it. The same job, the same dark, the same question, underneath all of it. Who are we doing this for? Shane's answer was intimate and specific. Negan's answer was systemic and general. The franchise's answer, slowly emerging across 15 years of storytelling, seems to be both simultaneously held in the same body by people who have earned the contradiction. Someone is standing at the wall right now, in whatever community the Walking Dead universe is currently building forward. No bat, no badge, no speech, just the wall, and the dark, and the people sleeping inside. Was Shane the better leader? Was Negan? I genuinely don't know, but I know that the person on that wall, keeping the watch out of love rather than fear, is the answer both men were trying to become. The watch rotation started in season 2 without a ceremony and without a name. It's still running. And that maybe is the most important thing either man left behind. Not the method, not the philosophy, not the system, or the myth. Just the understanding that someone has to stand there, and it matters that they care about why.